Hi, my name is Dr. Cami Fletcher, professor of history at Albright College and president of the Collective for Radical Death Studies. I want to thank you so much for being part of our panel. Today it's entitled Crisis Within a Crisis, Exploring Race, Ethnicity, and Nationality During a Pandemic. Let's first introduce our panel of experts. Can I have each of you introduce yourselves? Let's start with your titles, your affiliations, your organizations, your areas of expertise, and your research. So let's start with Mr. Gumisiriza. Then let's go to Dr. Lopez-Penaloza. And last, we will have Dr. Balkan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cami Fletcher. My name is George Gumisiriza, and Gumisiriza translates as patience in English language. I was recently awarded a PhD scholarship at the University of Bath, UK. I did a Master of Science in Social and Cultural Theory at the University of Bristol, UK. I live in the UK and I'm a further education lecturer and a spoken word artist. I'm very passionate about community social cohesion and integration in the UK. I'm a member of Migration Mobilities Bristol, in short, MMB, a specialist research institute based at the University of Bristol. My area of study is repatriationscapes, death and repatriation of human remains among African diaspora, a study into selected cases in London, UK. I coined the term repatriationscapes to refer to a framework for exploring death and repatriation of the deceased among diaspora in the UK to the home country. The framework adopts the stages of the ritual process by Victor Turner through the rites of passage by Guinea. My recent research addresses the significance of the repatriation of human remains as an aspect of cultural belonging among the Gambian community in Wales, UK. That will do.
Thank you.
Hello. Hi. My name is Dr. Judith Lopez-Penaloza. I live in Morelia, Michoacán, Mexico. And I have a master's degree in clinical psychology and by the State University in California, in the USA. And then I have a PhD by UNAM, National University of Mexico. I'm also a private practitioner. I'm a marriage and family therapist, and I have my private practice for the last 30 years. At the University of Michoacán, I'm a tenured professor for the last 20 years, and I teach and I do research. My research and my areas of interest are around death and grief, trauma, and resiliency, especially family resiliency, and also issues of migration. So what I do research about centers around all those topics. So lately I've been directing several theses of graduate students, doctorate students, and master's level around the issue of disenfranchised grief, which is one of my main interests as of now, having to do, for instance, with clandestine abortions that are illegal, or what happens to the grief of people and families of forced disappeared individuals. So that's where I'm at right now. I'm here in Morelia, Michoacán, Mexico. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Osman Balkan. I teach in the political science department at Swarthmore College, just outside of Philadelphia. My main area of research is the politics of migration, citizenship, and identity in Western Europe and the Middle East. I'm particularly interested, as all of my fellow panelists, in the area of necropolitics and in questions concerning mourning, memory, and the governance of dead bodies. I'm currently working on a book manuscript that's based on my doctoral dissertation that's called, tentatively titled, Dying Abroad, The Political Afterlives of Migration in Europe, which is based on long-term ethnographic fieldwork that I conducted in Berlin and Istanbul, during which I worked as an undertaker in several Islamic funeral homes. And I'm primarily interested in the question of what I call death out of place, or how migrants experience death and dying in countries where they face structural barriers to political inclusion. I've conducted research on the negotiations accompanying the burial and commemoration of both perpetrators and victims of political violence in the aftermath of events such as the Charlie Hebdo attacks in Paris, the Boston Marathon bombing, and the failed military coup attempt in Turkey in 2016. And I'm excited to join you all for this discussion. Thank you, Dr. Fletcher, for bringing us together.
Thank you all so much. If you're just now tuning in, our three panelists of experts, you can learn all about them in our bios. Go to www.radicaldeathstudies.com/crisis within crisis. Again, if you're just tuning in, that's the title of our program, Crisis Within Crisis, exploring race, ethnicity, and nationality during a pandemic. Mr. Gumisiriza, Dr. Lopez-Penaloza, and Dr. Balkan, thank you so much again for being here. We will discuss a crisis within a pandemic, a worldwide uprising at the murder of American George Floyd amidst a global pandemic due to the coronavirus. Central to these issues are death, whether by infection or white supremacy or colonialism, and then how race and ethnicity and nationality has impacted death, dying, grief, and memorial. So the first question that I have for you, Mr. Gumisiriza, is can you tell us how COVID-19 has really amplified issues of racism and oppression?
Thank you very much, Dr. Fletcher. That's an interesting question. There is a very thin line between racism and oppression, because all racialized people tend to be marginalized. However, the two terms can be used differently in different settings. So I'm going to basically talk about racism in the UK. And when I talk about oppression, it may be attributed to other countries, somewhere else, like in Africa. According to reports and statistics, racialized communities in the UK, commonly referred to as Black and Asian ethnic minorities, or BAME, have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19 pandemic. I'd like to say that the details of how COVID-19 has amplified racism and oppression is more reflected in individual stories within communities. Every incident and form of racism matters. Let me give you a story about myself. During this period, I have received phone calls and texts of people telling me to get out of the lockdown and go somewhere and get myself some more sunshine to boost my immunity in preparation for winter. And engaging with these people and talking a bit more, you realize that it's not coming from a good point, a good source. It's actually rooted in racism itself. COVID-19 appears to have permitted people to selectively talk about vitamin D deficiency argument, especially here in the UK, saying that being non-white is a major risk factor for coronavirus. And this has undermined existing social and economic inequalities while illuminating power relations between ethnicities in the UK. Black and Asian ethnic minorities in particular seem to be faced with a sense of self-consciousness. Imagine the stigma associated with being part of a perceived weaker ethnic background as compared with a safer one. So these issues really come through as a matter of racism and oppression in a number of ways. And of course, lockdown is a way to control the spread of the virus. We've seen it legitimized in a way of oppressing people, especially in countries in Africa, where people have faced hunger, beating, being killed, just because they have broken the lockdown rules. At least 2 people died in Uganda as a result of being shot at. Someone had to kill them because they had broken the rules of the lockdown. So we can say that the coronavirus pandemic has amplified racism and oppression in various ways.
Yeah, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Go ahead.
There is another important point which comes through language and metaphor, and this could be attributed to the politics of naming. We've all had Chinese virus, Wuhan virus, and this has amplified racism as they fed into racial-related tensions for ethnic minorities by personifying the pandemic. In the UK, there is a person who was attacked directly, and is called Jonathan Mock, an East Asian student who was assaulted in a racist coronavirus attack in London in early March. And then we've had things like the foreign virus, European virus, which is also personifying the pandemic. And these established specific misgivings, particularly in Africa, disassociation, outbursts of anger, culminating into other challenges of oppression within individual challenges and countries. So, responding to your question, we have seen the way in which coronavirus has amplified racism and oppression in different settings, cropping up through individual stories. But when they are all put together, of course, they affect the community as a whole, particularly the racialized communities.
Yeah, I don't think people realize that, because when we think about COVID-19, we think about this disease infecting people. But in this outcry of safety, right, these public health demands of social distancing and these rules, where definitely in the US, you saw police enforcing these rules, and you saw how people of color were being battered by it. I heard your story of saying that you had the police or some enforcement bang Black African, tell me the rest of it, indigenous minorities, right?
Yes.
That are being beaten up by the police for social distancing. You also saw that I had a question, a follow-up question on that. You also, so that's how you see these issues of racism being amplified. Not only are people of color being disproportionately killed, but in our quest to keep ourselves safe. So I have a follow-up question, really for anyone, whether it's Dr. Balkan or Dr. Lopez-Penaloza or you, Mr. Gumisiriza. How then have these issues of racism and oppression even highlighted identity politics, right? So you see in the US where death is being used as a vehicle for activism, right? So amidst this pandemic, American George Floyd has been murdered by white supremacy, and you see how that's being used. So maybe identity politics around nationality, particularly for the Gambians or even Africans in the UK. But for everyone, what issues of death and dying, and then for you, Mr. Gumisiriza, trying to repatriate back during a pandemic have been brought up. So this is really open to you to kind of follow up and expand on these things of repatriation in Gambia and the UK, or for any one of you to really kind of answer this.
Let me kickstart the discussion on that. In my research, I worked with the Senegambia Association based in the UK, where people from the Gambia and Senegal work together to repatriate the bodies of their beloved ones back to their home countries for burial. Ugandans do the same, and indeed across diasporic communities, people will come together and contribute towards the repatriation process. However, both Uganda and Senegal banned the return of dead bodies of COVID-19 to avoid the spread of the virus. Uganda, there wasn't any alternative whatsoever of saying, like, if you cremated the body, then you could bring the ashes. That was not an option. And then in Senegal, a group of families who lost people abroad went to court, citing infringement of religious rights. And then the Senegal Supreme Court upheld the ban. So the Senegalese locals decided to continue paying money to maintain the dead bodies in storage abroad, hoping to negotiate their return to Senegal for burial. Of course, here we can see that denying people to repatriate their dead to the home country through policy and regulation may be perceived as oppression and infringement of religious human rights. Of course, we are talking about the rights of the living in relation to the dead. And then COVID-19 legitimizes the status quo, which eliminates, I quote Dr. Balkan, structural alienation and exclusion. So, yes, and then government's reluctance to take responsibility or offer support to repatriate the dead citizens has been amplified by the coronavirus.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to comment on this idea of identity politics and how racism and oppression has highlighted it?
Happy to jump in on this topic, and I'll also address this question of repatriation among Muslim communities in a few minutes, hopefully. But I'd like to speak in terms and to bring up the issue of disposability and vulnerability. We have a number of philosophical concepts that we inherit from thinkers such as Michel Foucault and Judith Butler about the notion of biopolitics and grievability, which I think are quite relevant for our discussion. Foucault develops the notion of biopolitics to refer to the ways in which life itself has become an object of politics. In his work, he tracks transformations in the exercise of power and the ways in which political authorities are interested in managing the health and the health of the societies that they govern. And in his writings, Foucault argues that racism is actually a way of introducing a break into the domain of life taken over by power, the break between what must live and what must die. Racism, in his account, functions to create hierarchies between different human groups, hierarchies which are manifested in differential exposure to the risk of death. What the COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare for all to see is how already marginalized communities, the poor, the working classes, have been exposed to the risk of contracting and dying from COVID in much higher numbers. This reality is painted over by discourses which would describe such workers as heroes. In fact, I saw even the Wendy's drive-thru had a giant sign that said, "Heroes work here." And it has put very clearly for all to see the calculation that is that we are being asked to make between life and livelihood. In other words, people who don't have the luxury of staying home and working from home, who are on the front lines, be they the fast food workers or be they the medical care workers, and a whole host of other groups that whose labor has been deemed essential to the functioning of the economy. We have seen all too clearly, this is an ongoing discussion, as Lieutenant Governor of the state of Texas, Dan Patrick, said during discussions about reopening his state, quote, "There are more important things than living, and that's saving this country. We've got to take some risks to get back in the game and get this country back up and running." So I think one of the important points that I want to emphasize here in discussions of identity is issues of economic vulnerability, which workers are deemed essential and which are not, and this trade-off that we are being asked to make as we enter now the third month of lockdown between life versus livelihood.
Okay, I would like to add to the conversation the following thoughts. Definitely, I think that the pandemic in Mexico has highlighted something that we see every day, which is poverty. We see it pretty much everywhere. And it has just completely uncovered the vulnerability of the lower socioeconomic class. So here we do have issues of racism, of course, but also issues of classism, because it is very clear that the difference, there's a big gap, there's a huge difference in between the haves and the have-nots. And the have-nots are the ones that are going to the hospitals and being treated well. I like to think that as best as could be, but the reality is that lots of these people don't have the basic information about what's going on. I mean, this could be because of ignorance or lack of access to education, or because there is this big thing shared by a big number of the population that don't believe that COVID is really happening. So anyway, what's going on right now in Mexico City is that many people, I mean thousands of people, for the longest time at the beginning of the pandemic, went out in the street carelessly and freely, not necessarily because they needed to continue to work, which also is a reality, but because they didn't believe that this was happening. So The haves were more tending to stay home, to really inform themselves and do whatever it was they could do to take care of themselves and avoid getting sick. And people who didn't have the means were going, who were going in the street at the beginning because they didn't believe, but then because they had to continue working in whatever they could. Now those are the thousands that are going to the hospitals that have, of course, no more room, which is amplifying even more the drama that is behind every single one of these, the sick people. Just one is a family that is suffering, and it's not just individual, and it's not a number, although we tend to count them. So anyway, what's been going on here is that it feels like we've been receiving such confusing information from the government, where our own president, unfortunately, has come out to say, oh, go ahead, nothing happens. He doesn't wear a mask. He goes out. He is, as I'm speaking, he's going out and having meetings with people because he declared that now we can go out. When the country is at its worst, it's completely red. People are dying in incredible amounts. Now, that's another issue, the numbers, because, of course, their numbers are being hidden for reasons that are hard to understand, as if less dead people meant better government somehow. We don't understand. But the point that I want to make is that, of course, the most vulnerable people, economically speaking, and of course, health-wise, because there were previous things happening to them in terms of health, are being the ones being sacrificed in a way, I guess I can use that word, the most, because of the lack of care. They just don't reach appropriate care on time because the lack of respirators, because of the comorbidity of their other illnesses, but they're completely overrepresented in those numbers of dead people. Now, the other class, so to speak, the higher socioeconomic class, of course, they have access to private care. They have access to a lot more resources, medicine. They can afford other things, and they could afford being home. One of the most, I mean, as if all this was not painful enough, one thing that is really doing something terrible for the country is the administration, the government saying things that not only are confusing to understand, like mixed messages, but also really facilitating the idea of the people that have and the people that don't have are, I mean, this division is really being emphasized, and that's really hurting the country. And that we hear that pretty much every day in the government speeches, that the president comes out every day and he talks about things that he believes are relevant. And he always emphasizes, that people have money, and it's almost as if it's not good people. So that's been manifested already in things like, for instance, this example of someone who began to receive a lot of hate mail in Facebook because she and her mother had gone to a trip to Europe way back in February. And when they came back, the mother got sick and died from COVID. She was the fifth person who died. And this lady began to receive a lot of hate mail saying that you, rich people, are the ones who brought the virus to us. You are responsible. If you hadn't gone in your, like nice fancy trips, we would be okay, things like that. That's just one simple example of how this gap, this division that is being fomented by this government is really manifesting in a lot more conflict and a lot more violence, because you can almost touch it. It's people are like almost looking at each other like, with distrust, with hate even, and blaming each other for everything that's going wrong with this country. When the truth is that the institutions, the health institutions to begin with, were not prepared. We were told we were prepared. We were not prepared at all for such a demand on services. Actually, the whole health services, a part of the government was undergoing a re-engineering type of thing that was not done well, was not planned really well ahead of time. And in the middle of such a mess where kids with cancer were being left without their treatments, then we got the pandemic. So you can only imagine if we had already a crisis situation where parents were, going on riots and demonstrations because their kids were dying for lack of medicines. Now imagine with the pandemic inside. So it's, I know everywhere people are just absolutely suffering, and this is terrible. But there are some elements that make more painful what's going on. And I think we have, unfortunately, lots of those risk factors right now in this country.
Absolutely. I want to pick up on a lot of wonderful things that have been said, starting with the class element that Dr. Balkan brought up, and how the narrative has really, been transitioned to this idea of superheroes, and we're applauding the nurses and we're applauding the fast food workers, and just bring up the idea around the U.S. There were these Liberate the State rallies, and you saw a lot of white Americans, fully armed on the state capitol. Saw it in Pennsylvania. I was honestly shocked to see one a couple of blocks from my house. And the idea of luxury, right? This idea of I'm protesting because I want a haircut, I want to go out, just the juxtaposition of that and changing the narrative and how the narrative, is coming out. And then also, Dr. Balkan, when you were talking about this kind of idea of luxury, how the commercials are coming out now. They'll have a commercial now of people at home. I'm being a law-abiding citizen, like Mr. Gumisiriza was saying. I'm not out in the streets and doing these things to get locked up and be harassed by the police. I'm social distancing. I'm in the house. But that's a level of luxury, right? We can't go out but our class, element, we can stay in social distance that we're not talking about. I know when New York first opened, and how they were treating Black folks in the Bronx and other parts of New York that are predominantly African-American being harassed. And we all saw it. I know I did. Pictures of white Americans laid out on the grass, no mask, no gloves, no social distancing in sight, and how that other element, the Dr. Lopez-Penaloza that you're talking about, that other element, economic vulnerability, poverty, believability and trust is something else that I wanted to touch on that you all have talked about. One of the things that we saw with African Americans here in the U.S. was the narrative came out of, the reason why everyone that has COVID-19 in Richmond, Virginia died has been Black is because, this population already had pre-existing illness. They already had diabetes. They already had this. And so then they put themselves in a position to die, right? So we, as Americans, that has been the narrative, especially when you have the Surgeon General comes out and targets this group and says, stop smoking, lay off the tobacco, lay off the alcohol. So you see this narrative. And at the same time, that believability and that trust, where you have reports of Black folks going to the doctor in the hospital, not being believed. And the narrative coming out saying, oh, don't waste the hospital resources and giving people an inhaler and turning them away. And these people then dying. There was a school teacher in New York that she called the ambulance. It was a popularized story. She called the police. The ambulance came out. They didn't believe her. She made her way to the hospital. They didn't believe her. She ended up dying. This idea of believability. And Dr. Lopez-Penaloza, you talked about trust in the government and this misinformation. You see that in the States as well. But I also want to talk about that there's a history of Black Americans and the government and this idea of experimentation and exploitation, right? Many people still have not heard about the Tuskegee experiment, where you have the United States government experimenting, not treating Black men, hundreds of Black men who had syphilis, gave them syphilis and treated them for 1932, 1972, 40 years. Penicillin came out in the 40s. Right. So when you talk about this trust, there's another added element that's really been thrust forward. And I hope we have even more time to get into it. But Dr. Lopez-Penaloza, I wanted to piggyback and ask you this direct question. Again, with these identity politics and nationality in the U.S., we've seen several unarmed Americans murdered by the police, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, the latest, right, which has spurned this uprising. I wonder if you could speak to that added layer that you were talking about with parents and uprising, that many of us in the U.S. are now learning about the 43. There's a Netflix documentary where 43 students enrolled for a rural teachers college in Southwest Mexico just disappeared. And just talk to us about this disenfranchised grief, your understanding, and all of this added layer, in the middle of COVID-19.
Okay. Well, you probably know about the case. That's exactly how you said it. There's this rural school for teachers, and 43 students were out. Well, no, not only 43, were more. Out to do a riot. They were on their way, so to speak, to Mexico City for a big meeting that takes place October the 2nd, which is the anniversary of a huge student killing that took place in 1968. And they had an encounter. So these students were like in 3 different buses. They had an encounter with the police, and the police just began to shoot. There was a whole crisis going on. I mean, people running, they didn't know what was going on. And some of them run for their lives, and 43 couldn't. They were taken to police cars, and we don't know whatever happened to them. That's up to now. This happened in 2016. So it's going to be in September 26. It's going to be 4 years that this happening, and we don't know. There's versions. There's, of course, the government has what they call a historical truth, which talks about them being burned in a huge dump close by the town where they were coming from. But then there was this group from Argentina of forensic specialists who came and worked for, I believe it was 1 or 2 years, and they discovered that it was not possible. I mean, they really did a very thorough job and explained that that was not possible, that there has to be another explanation. Those students were not dead there, or not that way that they say. We still don't know. There's not one explanation that we get. But the point of this, behind the terrible, unspeakable horror of this story, is that missing people in Mexico is an entire phenomenon. And as of right now, officially, there are 60,000 people missing. But the group of parents, there's an office for the attention of victims of missing people. So most relatives of missing people are, let's say, there or go there. And they say, this group of parents, especially parents looking for their children, that their 60,000 is not at all any close to the real amount of people that is missing in Mexico. That is something that is really well documented elsewhere. I mean, it's extensive, the amount of information in that regard. So the point is that right now, with the pandemic, the 43 issue comes out to the light again, because not only is it horrible and something that needs to be really solved, but it highlights the whole entire phenomenon of the crime of missing people. And it's a crime that is committed every day until that person appears, either alive or dead. So there's all this layer of crime that is also interacting with all the pandemia stuff. And it's not only this movement or claim for all these people that are missing, but also we're having so many women being killed just because they're women. That is a huge issue right now. And also, it compounds how terrible all the situation it's happening right now. Now, the 43 story, if I can call it that way, also teaches us many, many lessons, because not only uncovers that other crimes that are making this country bleed in so many areas, but it allowed us to be able to say that we don't have the argument to blame the victim anymore, because when parents went to demand that their kids were missing to the offices of the police or something, the first response they got most of the time was, who knows what they were getting involved with. So that's blaming the victim. And the 43 showed us that argument doesn't hold. It never held before. It is clear that it doesn't hold anymore. So as of today, there's a group of parents outside, camping outside the house of the president, which is where the main palace of government in Mexico City, claiming or requesting or demanding to see him and talk to him, because he threatened to cut by 75% the budget of the office that attends to the victims of missing people, which the message he sends with that is that that's not really an important issue. We can dispose of it. So the issue of the violence behind the state violence, because it is clear that this is a state-committed crime, it's so many proof of that, is there, as well as all the other things interacting at the same time, which only feeds to what I meant before when I said that the the conflict that we feel in the what you can feel outside in the street. It's just exploding in this country as of right now. I don't know if I addressed her.
No, absolutely.
Uh-huh.
No, you did absolutely. And I want to get into the gender dynamics of dying, death, ritual, victim blaming, activism, national mourning. I'm definitely going to come back to that. I want to switch gears for a minute and talk about the last rites and funeral rituals that have shifted. Possibly, I'm seeing a lot of that. In the news where, well, now, Zoom funerals and we can use Zoom, this new technology. I saw one in a video game where one of the gamers had died and they, use the technology that way. These rituals that have been disrupted due to the coronavirus. Dr. Balkan, can you speak for this for Muslims in Europe and the US, please?
Absolutely. Well, the funeral rites in Islam are considered not just an individual task, but a communal obligation. The coronavirus has disrupted a number of aspects of a traditional Islamic funeral. So I'll just review that briefly. Typically, the body of a deceased Muslim is washed with water. This is a purifying ritual known as the ghusl. And they're washed before they're buried. But in the US, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention has issued guidelines that the body of anyone who has died from coronavirus should not be touched, obviously because of fears of contagion. So any sort of interaction that's going to occur post-mortem with human corpses has to be done using proper protective equipment. Some states in the United States, some areas have stopped performing the ghusl ritual altogether and have turned to another Islamic tradition known as the tayammum, which is a form of ritual purification that uses sand or dust. It's one that is typically used when no clean water is available. This has been one shift. Second important shift. Islam, like Judaism, calls for a speedy burial. Many Muslims have interpreted this to mean 24 hours after death, but the burial is supposed to take place as rapidly as possible after an individual has died. It's supposed to be without a coffin. The deceased is wrapped in a shroud known as kafan. Now, in the UK, the government introduced emergency coronavirus bill that stipulated that all of those who died from COVID-19 would be subject to mandatory cremation, which is something that both Muslims and Jews and Catholics, so I believe, would not get behind. The law was amended to allow exemptions based on religious faith. But these are the, some of the sort of religious ritual. There's some important points related to existing inequalities with, as relate to end-of-life care and post-mortem services for ethnic and religious minorities in the United States and Europe. The biggest one has to do with the availability of cemetery space. There was a number of articles in the New York Times in the last few weeks outlining the challenges faced by British Muslims, by French Muslims, who, even if they did wish to be buried in England or France, have limited access to cemeteries where there are sections reserved for Islamic burial. In France, less than 2% of all cemeteries, which are publicly administered, have spaces reserved for Muslims. In Germany, the number is even lower. About 1% of all cemeteries in Germany have spaces reserved for Muslims. So those that do want to be buried in the countries that they are living, the countries where they hold citizenship, face some existing challenges. As George brought up earlier, there's also the question of repatriation. In my research, I've found that many of, especially the first generation of migrants to places like Germany and France, for a variety of reasons, desire to be repatriated to countries of origin for burial. It's not always sentimental, although it is driven by feelings of social exclusion. There might be sort of economic motivations behind that as well. The cost of burial in these countries tends to be higher. But coronavirus has generated some issues regarding repatriation of corpses as well. Morocco and Tunisia have suspended repatriations altogether. Algeria and Mali only allow people who have not died of the coronavirus to return for burial. And Turkey allows repatriation even if the deceased has coronavirus, but the bodies are shipped in the hulls of cargo planes and no family members are allowed to accompany them. These are some of the practical issues. There's the issues that you raised regarding mourning rituals and rites and how, funerals, which are typically communal affairs, have been highly circumscribed due to social distancing regulations. This has impacted all communities, I think, and even our ideas of what constitute a good death, I believe, have been drastically impacted by the coronavirus. You hear stories of people dying alone on ventilators, right, because of the fears of contagion and so on. So I think this has had quite a substantial impact for minority communities, but also for majorities are facing some of the challenges that maybe have been in the background for ethnic and religious minorities for some time. But this question of a good death, dying alone, and so on now is clearly in the public eye.
Yeah. Can I just say,
please?
Can I just say something? I wonder, because of so many changes, restrictions in our rites and funeral rituals, I wonder how to the future we're going to find very grief. The grief is going to be very complicated in many cases, where we may even find different kinds of grief that we don't even know right now, because it's been so violated, something that we took for granted, that we practiced for years. I mean, we as humanity, each one in its own beliefs and customs, those things are so core to who we are as community, in our identity, either religious or ethnic, that to be not to be able to take the step of doing the funeral rites, the rituals, the goodbyes, it's really affecting mental health in people. It really is. The next pandemic, just like we've said it before, it's the mental health pandemic, because of so many side effects and after effects we're having, specifically around grief, I would believe, specifically around grief. It's been really painful, the way people are dying and not being able to, for the ones who died, but also for the family, not being able to, cry around the body, have the body, do whatever you need to do to the body.
Right.
It's just the absence of the body. It's an issue.
Mr. Gumisiriza, can you unmute yourself?
Yes. And if we can add, we did talk about the the European virus or the foreign virus, where there has been finger pointing, especially from the African continent. And if we related that to migration, where some Africans who have died with coronavirus, say in Europe, have been buried here, and due to the situation or the corona situation, they haven't been taken back. So they are buried here. But graves are such important aspects of life, especially to communities in a number of ways. So looking at the migration controls, policies and regulations in place, we are likely to see people going through perpetual grief because they are unable to visit the graves of their loved ones and have the funeral rituals done and rites and whatever it is. Is it possible that these nations are going to recognize that and get to sort of adjust the considerations for visas, whereby someone can say, or a community can come together and say, we are sending so-and-so as the clan leader or the head of the community to visit the grave for us and see where our son was buried or where our child was buried. Some communities have got rituals like taking the spirit home, taking back the person home. Are we going to see these countries adjusting or understanding the grief of people so that they can get to know that visiting a grave of a loved one can be a strong point for consideration when applying for visa? Otherwise, the finger pointing is going to continue, and people like Professor Dr. Lopez said, we are going to see perpetual grief because people didn't have a body to mourn over, and they haven't buried this person. How are they going to believe that somebody died and he was buried? So that is a very big question that faces both the governments, like here in the UK, and cross borders.
Yeah, but I'm glad that we switched there. Dr. Balkan talking about rituals and how they've been disrupted, and automatically, we're switching to this grief. And thinking about what you said, Dr. Balkan, this idea of a good death, there hasn't been a good death for African Americans. When you look at Dr. Lopez-Penaloza, your research, there hasn't been a body. So I think when we look, and I have a question here that I want to ask you all about community. But I think when you're looking at minority groups and when you're looking at people of color, our rituals have come out of this oppressive, marginalized life that we're living. When you look at African Americans and how the second funeral, this idea that during the institution of slavery, most slaveholders were not going to give you the day off and not going to allow you to do the rituals that you need to do because they've denied the life that you're living. So we have had to develop these rituals that are right on down to the RIP research that I do. Our society has completely dismissed these mostly Black males, especially during the height of the gang violence in the late 80s and the early 1990s. They've dismissed these folks, but people in our community have not. We've put them on a shirt. We have said, they're part of a kinship, pattern. So in thinking about all of that, which is so important, we know that death rituals serve to reinforce and define both the identity of self and community, social connections, culture, beliefs. Can we continue to have a discussion about how the pandemic has impacted this? Kind of continuing to talk about, what we were just saying here.
I can jump in quickly because I know we're running up against time here, but I think the reason this is an extremely important question, the question of what life is mourned, what counts for a grievable life, whose losses are considered losses by the community. In death, we see a mirror image of the value accorded to the lives of individuals in a given society. So the phrase Black Lives Matter resonates in so many ways. Black Life Matters, to insist that Black Lives Matter is to insist that Black life be accorded the same equality and dignity with all other lives. To have to insist of this message in the first place is an acknowledgement of the systematic disavowal and the structural racism and injustice that has fundamentally shaped the lives of African Americans in the United States. And it's an insistence that in not only in death are they mourned with dignity and equality, but their lives are acknowledged as part of our shared humanity. I think this is an extremely important point and one that cannot be emphasized strongly enough.
Yeah. Can I add to that? The example that you gave, Cami, about the slaves not getting one day off to go do the funerals, that's one example, a perfect example of disenfranchisement in grief. Because those deaths, as the ones that you talked about, Dr. Osman, they're not important for whoever is in power, whoever dictates the norms. So when society does not put value on that who is dying or dead, then there is this disenfranchisement that the message is very clear. This, you're not allowed, or you don't deserve, or this person, this death, or the way he died, or whoever he or she was, it's not worth the feelings or the rituals. So that is disenfranchisement. So then, like in the research we did with illegal abortion, here in my state, it's illegal to have abortions. So women who counted their stories told us of these horrible stories about not being able to, of course, share what they did because it's sinful and it's illegal. And not only because of outside, that's the norm, but because we grew up here, that norm is internalized. So you don't allow yourself to feel the normal grief, the normal feelings, to have the normal behaviors that you would have if it was sanctioned by society. So disenfranchised grief is exactly the message of saying, by someone in power, this body is worth mourning for, this one is not. This way of dying is good, this is not. There's stigmatized deaths that are not allowed to be recognized, etc. So it just caught my attention, the example that you gave, because that's perfect. The one you gave, Dr. Cami, in understanding where all the funeral rituals come from in the here and now, right? Because way back it was impossible to recognize. So now that it's perhaps a little bit more, at least not in the same way oppressed as symbolic now, perhaps, but not physically. So now you can celebrate and do whatever you want in the rituals of your particular community when you have a valuable body, so to speak, because everybody is a valuable body. So everybody is a valuable dead. But we have to give that value to that body. Otherwise, if whoever is in power is dictating who is and who isn't, then we have disenfranchisement all throughout our feelings and behaviors regarding grief, how we grieve, who we grieve for, in what manners, when, where, for how long, what do we wear, what do we eat. Everything is dictated from the outside. That's all I wanted to comment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Mr. Gumisiriza, did you want to add to this discussion?
Yes, I would like to say that it's we understand the situation of coronavirus and probably why the bodies have not been repatriated. But what next? Putting a ban to not returning the body and so on, is that enough? What's going to be the impact upon the communities? So I would think that there is going to be a lot of reflectivity upon these deaths, even in years to come. That's why we see, like, the death of George Floyd has appealed to the reflectivity into justice faced by people as individuals, as communities, as societies, as nations, as entire continents. As people begin to see, like, injustice happened, somebody died, and nothing was done. So this fresh sort of death brings up everything afresh again, where people begin to say, we can see this, but what does it speak into? So governments and leaders and communities have got to have this conversation going. And then we'd like to see, again, it would be important to see death taking its agency and speaking, rather than being encapsulated in religion, or being encapsulated in the medical sort of argument or trajectory, or being encapsulated in the journalistic sort of conversation. Let death speak for itself, because it's through death that we are going to see the funeral rituals and rites coming up and being talked about. It's through that that we are going to hear people talk about grief, bereavement, and their loss. And the collective, as related to the individual loss, should be coming together. And at the end of the day, there may not be a solution, but that conversation should be allowed to sort of go on. Consolation and healing would probably come out of that. Once it is suppressed, oppressed in any way, we shall still see it coming up time and again. And it might come through as protests, like we are seeing now, because everybody has got something that has not been addressed.
No, absolutely. And I think that is a really important segue to my last question here about activism. I love you saying that, Mr. Gumisiriza, this idea of taking death out of just medical, out of grief, well, not out of grief, but out of medical, was another point that you make, out of religion, because death is taking center stage. And looking at how it's been used with activism, definitely with African Americans, that's my research, and I could just have the gamut here, but we're seeing how, as you were elaborating on, and it's not just the death, it's the murder. The murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the hundreds of others by white supremacy, right? This idea of colonialism. We need to decolonize, death and death studies, where people are seeing that this is a murder. This is completely tied to white supremacy and racism. So here's my last question that I would love for us to address here. How has this pandemic legitimized the oppression and invisibility of certain racial, ethnic groupings? So how, in some ways, as we've talked about with African Americans, has this led to hypervisibility that has been then a catalyst for change and agency, especially with this call for visas and repatriation that has come here? So I'd like your thoughts on this idea of death as agency, a catalyst for change right in the middle of this pandemic.
I would think that it takes understanding, because the way death is understood across cultural perspectives and then the religious perspectives may be different. But in this situation of the pandemic, everybody has seen what death looks like. Therefore, there shouldn't be anyone to claim that I don't understand your culture, I don't understand your religion. That is irrelevant, because people should be able to understand death. And when someone comes out to say, I lost somebody, he died with coronavirus, people should be able to understand. Here in the UK, there are reports that are coming out into the reports on the deaths of the Black and Asian ethnic minorities, because they have been disproportionately affected. And these reports are being looked at, and they are going to be scrutinized. We are going to discuss these reports in terms of how and why and what's next. So that calls for understanding. People should be able to get away, to move away from the authoritative sort of perspective of looking at things, and get to understanding that death is death, and it affects individuals as well as communities. But coming back to the main point, definitely the racialized communities have been ripped of their authority to stand and speak, because the authority is being replaced by grief and loss and bereavement. And that is a very important key to see coming through any report that is going to be published. And of course, the steps to be taken on how to help or to support, not to help, but to support these communities stand strong again.
Well, it has moved so many things. I mean, it has really moved so many pieces that the systems of family, of community, of government, or just you as a system as well, cannot be unchanged. Cannot be untouched by change. I believe that there's going to be so many changes manifested, for instance, in agency of your own health. For instance, perhaps, I'm just thinking right now that that could be one, or agency over your planning to the future, if that's at all possible in terms of economic aspects. What I'm trying to say is that there is no one area of anybody's life that is going to be equal as it was before. How that changed is going to look like, I don't think we're beginning to see that yet. I think we're in the process of that change. I think that how we're going to come out at the other end, better people, better society or not, we're going to be seeing that. More violence, less violence, we're going to be seeing that. What we see right now are indicators that things are not going to be arranging themselves really nicely, because just for the indicators that we have. Police violence in Mexico is also increasing. We had the same thing done to students. I mean, recently, as last week, there's at least 3 more young people being assaulted, attacked, brutalized by police for different reasons in the last month. So everything that we are seeing is the unrest in every sense of our lives will have to settle somehow, because crises are not forever. They look for resolution. That resolution could be for better or for worse. So I don't think we're seeing it yet. I really would hope that the work agency will be primary in our paradigm of how we see life, how we see ourselves in the future. But I really think it's a little early in the macro view of things to know how we're going to become as individuals, communities, and society. That's what I wanted to comment. Thank you.
I agree that it's still quite too soon to tell how this will all resolve. But what the coronavirus has done is laid bare, and for all to see, for those who would like to look, systematic and structural level inequalities that have been present in societies around the world for a very long time. The very notion of equality, always an aspiration, is being shown as what it is, an aspiration. We see that certain lives are rendered disposable by an economic system that values profit making above all else. We see that this tension that I mentioned earlier between the choice that many people are facing between life and livelihood. All of these things, we see how the virus has disproportionately impacted communities of color around the world who happen to be those essential workers or heroes that are so applauded, but who are being held hostage by a system that compels them to work or starve. So everything is out in the open in a way that only a global species event, I think, could have brought to our attention. The question is, are we going to look, or are we just going to turn our heads away? So the future remains open, but this is an important and historical opportunity, and we should never let a good crisis go to waste.
We'll definitely end on that.
Yeah.
I have thoroughly enjoyed this panel. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Mr. Gumisiriza. I want to thank Dr. Lopez-Penaloza and Dr. Balkan. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. For those of you who tuned in the middle of this, or even right now, this video will be on the Collective for Radical Debt Studies, our website, www.radicaldebtstudies.com. It will be on our Facebook page, our Twitter, and our Instagram. If you did not get your question answered, we are going to continue this discussion on social media. So go to Facebook, where I'm sure you're watching this live right now, and continue. There were some great ideas and topics brought up regarding class, economic vulnerability, poverty. And we really didn't even touch on the idea of leadership. Anytime you're in a global crisis, nationally, there's leadership. The New York Times or it was either the Post, had a great article, "Are We Really Mourning?" And the whole front page was 1,000 obituaries, right? So where's the national mourning that's going on here? And we can say that George Floyd and his funeral that was on full display was that mourning. We didn't touch on the gender dynamics or even this idea of the body and disposal, but we ended with activism, which I think is very important and central. But of all of these questions and topics, like I said, the conversation will keep going. Please go to our social media. And I want to thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you. See you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.